Walter Briggs, a 7-year-old Navy veteran, faces rejection at Bayfield Shores' modernized marina. His wooden boat, Horizon Belle, doesn't fit the new aesthetic, and harbor manager Chad Ellison publicly humiliates him, declaring it, "We don't serve people like you." Walter, who teaches underprivileged kids to sail and respect the sea, leaves quietly, unaware that grad student Lena Cho recorded the incident. Her viral video sparks outrage, revealing Walter's heroic past, saving lives, including a young Admiral. As the town grapples with its fading values, a naval fleet looms on the horizon, hinting at justice for a forgotten hero. If Walter's story moved you, join us in honoring quiet heroes. Like, subscribe, and share to spread this tale of dignity and remembrance. Comment your thoughts. Let's keep the conversation alive. Support our channel to ensure stories like Walter's inspire others. Together, let's make honor matter again. The harbor manager's voice cut through the morning air like a jagged blade, sharp and unyielding, loud enough to hush the usual clamor of the docks. "We don't serve people like you," he barked, his words dripping with disdain as they echoed across the weathered planks of Bayfield Shores marina. The scattered dockhands, fishermen, and early risers froze, their chatter silenced, their eyes darting toward the scene. Walter Briggs, a wiry man of 77 with a face etched by decades of sun and salt, stood unflinching. His heart, though, sank, not from the assault but from the sting of rejection in a place he'd once called home. He didn't raise his voice or clench his fists. Instead, he reached into the worn pocket of his faded jacket and pulled out a military ID, its edges frayed, the photo blurred by time but the rank still unmistakable. Command Master Chief, U.S. Navy. He held it out, not as a challenge, but as a quiet statement of who he was. The harbor manager barely glanced at it. The crowd, a mix of curious onlookers and indifferent yacht owners, stayed silent. No one stepped forward. No one cared. Walter's wooden boat, the Horizon Belle, bobbed gently at the edge of the dock, its mahogany ribs and pine decking a stark contrast to the gleaming fiberglass speedboats and polished cruisers that now dominated the marina. It wasn't flashy enough for this new Bayfield, a town transformed by wealth and ambition, where luxury condos and fusion restaurants had replaced the gritty charm of fish markets and motor oil. The harbor manager waved a dismissive hand, signaling for Walter to leave. Defeated but not broken, Walter climbed aboard his boat, the familiar creak of the deck under his boots a small comfort. As he motored away, the weight of the moment settled into his chest, a mix of frustration, sadness, and a flicker of defiance. He'd built that boat with his own hands, every plank and nail a testament to his life's work. To be turned away from the place he'd poured his heart into felt like a betrayal. 2 days later, the horizon shifted. 6 Navy ships emerged from the morning mist, their steel hulls slicing through the calm waters of the bay. No sirens blared, no flags waved in ceremony, just the quiet, imposing presence of naval might. The townsfolk gathered along the shore, their murmurs rising as a rear admiral stepped onto the dock, his uniform crisp, his gaze steady. The crowd parted, their earlier indifference replaced by awe and unease. "I'm looking for Walter Briggs," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the authority and respect. The harbor manager, now pale and stammering, stood frozen. The Admiral's words hung in the air, a reminder of a truth the town had forgotten. Heroes don't always wear capes or demand recognition, but when they're dismissed, the world takes notice. Sometimes, the Admiral continued, when a nation forgets its heroes, the Navy shows up to remind them. Walter, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, felt a swell of pride tempered by humility. He hadn't asked for this, but the sight of those ships stirred memories of a life spent serving, of storms weathered and lives saved. Bayfield Shores hadn't always been a playground for the wealthy. Decades ago, it was a working-class coastal town, alive with the raw, salty pulse of the sea. The air carried the sharp tang of fish and diesel, and the early mornings rang with the clatter of crab traps, the low hum of outboard motors, and the easy laughter of dockhands sharing stories over steaming mugs of black coffee. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where the rhythm of the tides set the pace of life. Walter had fallen in love with Bayfield in those days. drawn to its unpretentious beauty and the unspoken bond among its people. Now, at 77, he lived in a modest one-bedroom cottage just beyond the curve of the coastline, a weathered, whitewashed home with a creaking screen door and a small porch that faced the inlet. The locals called it the last real house in Bayfield, a relic of a time before glass towers and rooftop bars. From his porch, Walter could watch the sunrise paint the water gold. And though the town had changed, that view remained his anchor. Every morning as the first light broke over the horizon, Walter walked the familiar path to the dock where the Horizon Belle waited. The boat wasn't much to look at compared to the sleek yachts that now crowded the marina. Its hull, crafted from mahogany and pine, bore the scars of years at sea, faint scratches, faded paint, and a navy blue trim that Walter touched up religiously. An American flag, always fresh, fluttered at the stern, replaced every 6 months, no matter how fiercely the coastal winds battered it. To Walter, the Horizon Belle was more than a boat. It was a vessel of memory, a living archive of his life's joys and losses. Every knot in its wood, every curve of its frame, carried the weight of his hands, his sweat, his quiet pride. Building it had been a labor of love, a way to honor the sea that had shaped him. As he ran his fingers along its railing, he felt the echo of younger days. Days of purpose, of camaraderie, of knowing he was part of something bigger. Walter hadn't always been the quiet, unassuming man in a faded ball cap. In his prime, he was Command Master Chief Walter Briggs, a name that carried weight in Navy circles. He'd led coastal rescue units through the worst of nature's fury, hurricanes that tore through towns, floods that swallowed homes. In the 1980s, his team had plucked stranded families from rooftops, their faces etched with fear and gratitude as they clung to his crew's steady hands. In the early 90s, they'd chased drug runners across the Gulf, intercepting boats laden with enough narcotics to devastate entire communities. Each mission had tested him, not just physically, but emotionally. He'd seen the fragility of life, the thin line between hope and despair, and it had shaped him into a man who valued action over words, service over glory. His footlocker, tucked under his bed, held rows of commendations, medals and ribbons that told a story of courage and sacrifice. But Walter didn't display them. To him, legacy wasn't about accolades. It was about what you left behind in the hearts of others. When he retired to Bayfield Shores, Walter sought a quieter purpose. He found it in the Horizon Belle and the children who needed it most. Every Wednesday and sometimes Saturdays, he took kids out on the water, not the privileged ones with private tutors and summer camps, but the quiet ones, the overlooked ones. Kids with single parents working double shifts, kids with patched backpacks, and dreams bigger than their circumstances. He taught them to tie sailors' knots, to read tide charts, to feel the wind's subtle shifts. He showed them how to raise the flag, one hand over their heart, the other gripping the halyard, as he stood beside them, a steady presence. He didn't talk about his Navy days or the medals in his footlocker. Instead, he shared stories of the sea's wonders, of whales breaching off the coast in spring, of the winter in '89 when the bay froze solid, of the way the water whispered secrets if you listened closely enough. Those moments on the Horizon Belle weren't just lessons. They were lifelines, offering the kids a sense of belonging, a spark of possibility. For Walter, those mornings were his reason to keep going. He saw himself in those kids, their curiosity, their resilience, their unspoken need for someone to believe in them. He remembered his own childhood, growing up in a small town where opportunities were scarce, where the sea had been his escape and his teacher. Each time a shy kid grinned after tying a perfect bowline or a teenager wrote him a letter from college, Walter felt a quiet pride that no medal could match. Some of those kids came back every summer, their faces brighter, their shoulders straighter. Others, now grown, brought their own children to the Horizon Belle, their eyes shining with gratitude as they watched their kids raise the flag. None of them ever paid a dime, and Walter wouldn't have had it any other way. To him, the Drodo system, Horizon Belle, was a gift to the future, a way to pass on the lessons of the sea and the strength it demanded. But Bayfield Shores had changed, its heart reshaped by the slow creep of wealth and exclusivity. The gritty docks where fishermen once mended nets were now lined with glossy yachts owned by people who rarely set foot in the town. The old fish market had been replaced by a sleek bistro serving overpriced ceviche, and the laughter of dockhands had been drowned out by the hum of private helicopters. Walter felt the shift like a slow ache in his bones. The town he loved had become a stranger, its soul buried under polished surfaces. The new marina, with its pristine facilities and steep fees, had no place for a man like Walter or a boat like the Horizon Belle. The harbor manager's words that day, "We don't serve people like you," hadn't just been a rejection of Walter. They were a rejection of everything Bayfield once stood for. As Walter stood on the dock after the Admiral's arrival, watching the Navy ships loom in the distance, he felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was pride, yes, in knowing his service hadn't been forgotten by those who mattered. But there was also sorrow for the town that had lost its memory, for the kids who might never know the Bayfield he'd loved. He didn't need the Navy's show of force to validate his worth. He'd never sought applause. Yet the sight of those ships, their silent strength, was a reminder that some bonds between a man and his country, between a sailor and the sea, couldn't be erased by time or indifference. The crowd's stunned faces, the harbor manager's sudden humility, none of it mattered as much as the kids watching from the shore, their eyes wide with wonder. For them, Walter thought, he'd keep going. For them, the Horizon Belle would sail again tomorrow. The harbor manager's voice cut through the morning air like a jagged blade, sharp and unyielding, loud enough to hush the usual clamor of the docks. "We don't serve people like you," he barked, his words dripping with disdain as they echoed across the weathered planks of Bayfield Shores Marina. The scattered dockhands, fishermen, and early risers froze, their chatter silenced, their eyes darting toward the scene. Walter Briggs, a wiry man of 77 with a face etched by decades of sun and salt, stood unflinching. His heart, though, sank, not from the insult, but from the sting of rejection in a place he'd once called home. He didn't raise his voice or clench his fists. Instead, he reached into the worn pocket of his faded jacket and pulled out a military ID, its edges frayed, the photo blurred by time, but the rank still unmistakable. Command Master Chief, U.S. Navy. He held it out, not as a challenge, but as a quiet statement of who he was. The harbor manager barely glanced at it. The crowd, a mix of curious onlookers and indifferent yacht owners, stayed silent. No one stepped forward. No one cared. Walter's wooden boat, the Horizon Belle, bobbed gently at the edge of the dock, its mahogany ribs and pine decking a stark contrast to the gleaming fiberglass speedboats and polished cruisers that now dominated the marina. It wasn't flashy enough for this new Bayfield, a town transformed by wealth and ambition, where luxury condos and fusion restaurants had replaced the gritty charm of fish markets and motor oil. The harbor manager waved a dismissive hand, signaling for Walter to leave. Defeated but not broken, Walter climbed aboard his boat, the familiar creak of the deck under his boots a small comfort. As he motored away, the weight of the moment settled into his chest, a mix of frustration, sadness, and a flicker of defiance. He'd built that boat with his own hands, every plank and nail a testament to his life's work. To be turned away from the place he'd poured his heart into felt like a betrayal. 2 days later, the horizon shifted. 6 Navy ships emerged from the morning mist, their steel hulls slicing through the calm waters of the bay. No sirens blared, no flags waved in ceremony, just the quiet, imposing presence of naval might. The townsfolk gathered along the shore, their murmurs rising as a rear admiral stepped onto the dock, his uniform crisp, his gaze steady. The crowd parted, their earlier indifference replaced by awe and unease. "I'm looking for Walter Briggs," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and respect. The harbor manager, now pale and stammering, stood frozen. The admiral's words hung in the air, a reminder of a truth the town had forgotten. Heroes don't always wear capes or demand recognition, but when they're dismissed, the world takes notice. Sometimes, the admiral continued, when a nation forgets its heroes, the Navy shows up to remind them. Walter, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, felt a swell of pride tempered by humility. He hadn't asked for this, but the sight of those ships stirred memories of a life spent serving, of storms weathered, and lives saved. Bayfield Shores hadn't always been a playground for the wealthy. Decades ago, it was a working-class coastal town, alive with the raw, salty pulse of the sea. The air carried the sharp tang of fish and diesel, and the early mornings rang with the clatter of crab traps, the low hum of outboard motors, and the easy laughter of dockhands sharing stories over steaming mugs of black coffee. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where the rhythm of the tides set the pace of life. Walter had fallen in love with Bayfield in those days, drawn to its unpretentious beauty and the unspoken bond among its people. Now, at 77, he lived in a modest one-bedroom cottage just beyond the curve of the coastline, a weathered, whitewashed home with a creaking screen door and a small porch that faced the inlet. The locals called it the last real house in Bayfield, a relic of a time before glass towers and rooftop bars. From his porch, Walter could watch the sunrise paint the water gold, and though the town had changed, that view remained his anchor. Every morning as the first light broke over the horizon, Walter walked the familiar path to the dock where the Horizon Belle waited. The boat wasn't much to look at compared to the sleek yachts that now crowded the marina. Its hull, crafted from mahogany and pine, bore the scars of years at sea, faint scratches, faded paint, and a navy blue trim that Walter touched up religiously. An American flag, always fresh, fluttered at the stern, replaced every 6 months no matter how fiercely the coastal winds battered it. To Walter, the Horizon Belle was more than a boat. It was a vessel of memory, a living archive of his life's joys and losses. Every knot in its wood, every curve of its frame, carried the weight of his hands, his sweat, his quiet pride. Building it had been a labor of love, a way to honor the sea that had shaped him. As he ran his fingers along its railing, he felt the echo of younger days. Days of purpose, of camaraderie, of knowing he was part of something bigger. Walter hadn't always been the quiet, unassuming man in a faded ball cap. In his prime, he was Command Master Chief Walter Briggs, a name that carried weight in Navy circles. He'd led coastal rescue units through the worst of nature's fury, hurricanes that tore through towns, floods that swallowed homes. In the 1980s, his team had plucked stranded families from rooftops, their faces etched with fear and gratitude as they clung to his crew's steady hands. In the early 90s, they'd chased drug runners across the Gulf, intercepting boats laden with enough narcotics to devastate entire communities. Each mission had tested him, not just physically, but emotionally. He'd seen the fragility of life, the thin line between hope and despair, and it had shaped him into a man who valued action over words, service over glory. His footlocker, tucked under his bed, held rows of commendations, medals and ribbons that told a story of courage and sacrifice. But Walter didn't display them. To him, legacy wasn't about accolades. It was about what you left behind in the hearts of others. When he retired to Bayfield Shores, Walter sought a quieter purpose. He found it in the Horizon Belle and the children who needed it most. Every Wednesday and sometimes Saturdays, he took kids out on the water. Not the privileged ones with private tutors and summer camps, but the quiet ones, the overlooked ones. Kids with single parents working double shifts, kids with patched backpacks, dreams bigger than their circumstances. He taught them to tie sailors' knots, to read tide charts, to feel the wind's subtle shifts. He showed them how to raise the flag, one hand over their heart, the other gripping the halyard, as he stood beside them, a steady presence. He didn't talk about his Navy days or the medals in his footlocker. Instead, he shared stories of the sea's wonders, of whales breaching off the coast in spring, of the winter in '89 when the bay froze solid, of the way the water whispered secrets if you listened closely enough. Those moments on the Horizon Belle weren't just lessons, they were lifelines, offering the kids a sense of belonging, a spark of possibility. For Walter, those mornings were his reason to keep going. He saw himself in those kids, their curiosity, their resilience, their unspoken need for someone to believe in them. He remembered his own childhood, growing up in a small town where opportunities were scarce, where the sea had been his escape and his teacher. Each time a shy kid grinned after tying a perfect bowline or a teenager wrote him a letter from college, Walter felt a quiet pride that no medal could match. Some of those kids came back every summer, their faces brighter, their shoulders straighter. Others, now grown, brought their own children to the Horizon Belle, their eyes shining with gratitude as they watched their kids raise the flag. None of them ever paid a dime, and Walter wouldn't have had it any other way. To him, the Zrodo system, Horizon Bell, was a gift to the future, a way to pass on the lessons of the sea and the strength it demanded. But Bayfield Shores had changed, its heart reshaped by the slow creep of wealth and exclusivity. The gritty docks where fishermen once mended nets were now lined with glossy yachts owned by people who rarely set foot in the town. The old fish market had been replaced by a sleek bistro serving overpriced ceviche, and the laughter of dockhands had been drowned out by the hum of private helicopters. Walter felt the shift like a slow ache in his bones. The town he loved had become a stranger, its soul buried under polished surfaces. The new marina, with its pristine facilities and steep fees, had no place for a man like Walter or a boat like the Horizon Bell. The harbor manager's words that day, "We don't serve people like you," hadn't just been a rejection of Walter. They were a rejection of everything Bayfield once stood for. As Walter stood on the dock after the Admiral's arrival, watching the Navy ships loom in the distance, he felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was pride, yes, in knowing his service hadn't been forgotten by those who mattered. But there was also sorrow for the town that had lost its home, for the kids who might never know the Bayfield he'd loved. He didn't need the Navy's show of force to validate his worth. He'd never sought applause. Yet the sight of those ships, their silent strength, was a reminder that some bonds between a man and his country, between a sailor and the sea, couldn't be erased by time or indifference. The crowd's stunned faces, the harbor manager's sudden humility, none of it mattered as much as the kids watching from the shore, their eyes wide with wonder. For them, Walter thought, he'd keep going. For them, the Horizon Bell would sail again tomorrow. The salty breeze of Bayfield, once a gritty coastal town where fishermen swapped stories over steaming coffee, had been swept away by a wave of gentrification. The bait shops, their shelves stocked with lures and their air thick with the scent of the sea, had been gutted and reborn as juice bars, their chalkboard menus touting kale smoothies and acai bowls. The old diner where Walter Briggs once lingered over bacon and eggs, its jukebox humming with forgotten tunes, had shuttered, only to reopen as a wine cafe with gleaming glassware and valet service for sleek SUVs. The marinas, once bustling with the clatter of crab traps and the camaraderie of weathered dockhands, had been bought up by faceless development firms from far-off cities. They transformed them into harbor lifestyle communities, complete with iron gates, security patrols, and aesthetic codes that demanded every boat shine like a yacht in a magazine spread. Walter Briggs, however, stood firm against the tide. His boat, the Horizon Bell, was a relic of his own making, its hull scarred by years of battling the sea, its paint chipped but its heart unbreakable. His denim shirt, faded and stained with salt, was a testament to his life on the water. His boots, hand-stitched and worn, carried him with the same steady rhythm they always had. Every sidelong glance from a tourist, every request from an influencer to move your boat for the shot, cut deeper than he'd admit. Their words, "You don't fit the brand," echoed in his mind, but Walter's resolve only grew. To him, Bayfield wasn't about polished surfaces or viral posts. It was about the people, their shared history, their quiet triumphs, the way the sea bound them together. Yet, week by week, the dockmaster pushed his slip farther down the pier, relegating him to the margins of a town that was starting to forget its own heart. The change crept in quietly, like the first clouds of a storm still miles offshore. Walter felt it most keenly when he arrived at Slip 12, his home for years, and saw a new nameplate, reserved for platinum members only. The words hit like a slap, cold and impersonal. No one had called, no one had warned him. His chest tightened with a mix of anger and betrayal, but he kept his face steady. At the marina's new desk, all glass and chrome, a young clerk brushed off his question with a smile that felt rehearsed. "We've updated our layout," she said, her voice light, as if she were explaining a parking fine. "You're at Dock 6 now, by the fuel station." Dock 6 was a forgotten corner, where algae clung to the concrete and the air carried the faint tang of diesel. Walter's pride stung, but he didn't argue. He hoisted the rope over his shoulder, its coarse fibers a familiar comfort, and led the Horizon Bell to its new spot, his steps deliberate, his heart heavy but unbowed. 3 months later, Chad Ellison arrived, the new harbor manager with a tan that seemed to defy the coastal fog and a marina-branded polo that screamed corporate ambition. Chad spoke in slick phrases, calling everything a branding opportunity or a chance to elevate the experience. To him, the marina was a product, not a community. When he first saw Walter, he didn't see the man who'd spent decades teaching kids to fish or building his boat plank by plank. He saw only the horizon bell, its weathered deck a blemish on his vision of perfection. "That yours?" he asked, his eyebrow raised in judgment. Walter's voice was calm but proud. "Built her myself. 22 years ago." Chad's tight smile and quick taps on his tablet said more than words could. Walter felt a knot of unease in his gut, a sense that the storm was closer now, its shadow darkening the horizon. The pressure built steadily. One week, the power station at Walter's dock failed without warning. No one apologized, and no one came to fix it. Walter rigged a solution, his hands deft from years of making do, but the slight burned. Then came the notice, taped to the horizon bell's windshield like an afterthought. "This vessel does not meet visual compliance standards. Please contact harbor management." The words felt like a personal attack, each syllable chipping away at the life Walter had built. He carried the note to the office, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief, only to be met by a receptionist who didn't even look up. It wasn't just him. The crabber with the rust-stained deck, whose hearty laugh once filled the docks, was being pushed out. The quiet woman with the catamaran who taught kids to snorkel with endless patience was told her boat didn't fit the vibe. Bayfield's soul was being replaced with curated playlists in the sterile glow of social media filters, and Walter's heart ached for the town he loved. Everything came to a head on a crisp Wednesday morning, one that carried the promise of something extraordinary. Walter had a fishing trip planned for 8 fifth graders from a Title I school in the next town over. For some, it would be their first glimpse of the ocean, their first chance to feel its vastness and mystery. Their teacher, Miss Leah Jennings, stood in the parking lot, herding the kids with their brown bag lunches and water bottles, her smile warm but tired from the effort of making this day happen. Leah's dedication stirred something in Walter, a reminder of why he kept showing up. He wore his cleanest denim shirt, its faded blue a quiet gesture of respect for the occasion, and brought extra life vests, knowing some kids might not have their own. He docked the horizon bell in what he thought was still his spot, his heart swelling with anticipation for the kids' wide-eyed wonder. But as he stepped onto the pier, a shadow fell over him, and the storm that had been gathering for months was about to break. The salty breeze carried a sting that morning, sharper than Walter Briggs expected as he stood on the weathered deck of his boat, the horizon bell. He was preparing for another day of teaching kids how to fish, his routine for over a decade. The familiar creak of the dock under his boots grounded him, but a voice sliced through the air, jarring his focus. "You can't tie up here anymore." The words were crisp, authoritative, and laced with disdain. Walter's weathered hands paused on the rope he was coiling. He looked up, squinting against the morning sun glinting off the water. Striding down the pier was Chad Ellison, the marina's new manager, his polished loafers clicking with purpose. A tablet gleamed in his hand, and sunglasses rested atop his meticulously gelled hair, catching the light like a crown. Chad's face was set, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond Walter, as if the older man were an inconvenience to be swept away. "This isn't your slip anymore," Chad continued, his tone clipped. "We've upgraded our aesthetic standards. Your boat doesn't comply with our new guidelines." Walter's chest tightened, a slow burn of disbelief rising within him. He rose to his full height, his joints protesting after years of service. First in the Navy, then here, on this very dock. "I've had a berth agreement since 2009, he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of memory. "I've been teaching kids here every week for over 10 years. The words felt like an anchor, grounding him in the truth of his life's work. Chad's fingers danced across his tablet, the screen's glow reflecting in his eyes. "That was before the rebrand," he said, still not meeting Walter's gaze. "We're a premium destination now. We cater to a specific clientele. Your boat?" He gestured vaguely toward the horizon bell, its wooden hull worn but lovingly maintained. It doesn't fit the image we're crafting. The words landed like a slap, each one deliberate, meant to diminish. Walter's mind raced, replaying the countless mornings he'd spent here. He saw the faces of the children he taught, wide-eyed, eager, often from families who could never afford a boat of their own. He felt the pride of showing them how to bait a hook, the joy of their laughter when they reeled in their first catch. This dock wasn't just a place to moor. It was where he'd found purpose after the Navy, where he'd built a legacy of giving back. And now this stranger was dismissing it all with a flick of his wrist. Nearby, a few tourists paused, their curiosity piqued by the tension. Some fumbled for their phones, sensing a spectacle. Others averted their eyes, uncomfortable witnesses to a man's life being upended. Walter's hand moved to his jacket, pulling out a worn folder. Inside were his Coast Guard license, his veteran's ID, and a letter from the local school affirming his role as a volunteer educator. These documents were his armor, proof of who he was and what he'd done. He held them out, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the injustice of having to prove himself at all. Chad barely glanced at the papers. "I don't care who you used to be," he said, his voice rising, carrying across the dock for all to hear. "This marina has standards, and you, sir, don't meet them." Then came the words that would sear themselves into the memory of everyone present. "We don't serve people like you." The dock fell silent, the lapping of waves against the pilings the only sound. Walter's breath caught, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and sorrow. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, to remind this man of the lives he'd touched, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not with the children arriving just then, their small figures appearing at the end of the pier, their teacher herding them forward. Their faces, usually bright with anticipation, were now clouded with confusion. One boy, who'd been coming to Walter's lessons for years, had been beaming moments before. Now his smile faded, like a candle snuffed out by a sudden gust. Walter's grip tightened on the folder, the edges of the papers crinkling under his fingers. He felt the weight of every eye on him. Tourists, children, the teacher, even the gulls overhead seemed to pause. But he wouldn't give Chad the satisfaction of a scene. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, he turned to the horizon bell. His hands moved with the muscle memory of a lifetime at sea, untying the ropes with deliberate care. He glanced at the children, offering a gentle wave, a silent apology for a day stolen from them. Then, with a quiet resolve, he guided his boat away from the dock, the only home he'd known for 15 years. Unbeknownst to Walter, a young woman sat on the patio of a nearby cafe, her iced coffee sweating in the summer heat. Lena Cho, a 26-year-old marine biology grad student, had come to Bayfield Shores to study the impact of modernization on coastal ecosystems. Her notebook was open, filled with scribbled observations about tidal patterns and marine life. But her attention had shifted when Chad's voice cut through the morning calm. "We don't serve people like you." The words hit her like a wave, cold and jarring. Lena's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. She saw Walter's stillness, the way his shoulders squared as he absorbed the insult. She saw the folder in his hands, the documents that represented a life of service. And she saw the children, their disappointment palpable even from a distance. Without thinking, she'd pulled out her phone and started recording, her hands shaking slightly as she captured the raw injustice of the moment. As Walter untied his boat and drifted away, Lena sat frozen, the video still running. Her mind churned with questions. Who was this man? Why was he being treated this way? The weight of what she'd witnessed settled in her chest, a mix of anger and sadness. She stopped the recording and stared at the screen. The image of Walter's boat fading into the horizon burned into her mind. That evening, Lena asked around town. In a place like Bayfield, stories linger like sea mist. "That's Walter Briggs," a shopkeeper told her. "Navy veteran, teaches kids to fish for free, been doing it forever." Each conversation painted a fuller picture of a man who'd given everything to his community, only to be cast aside for the sake of a polished image. Back in her rented room, Lena replayed the video. It wasn't just Chad's words that struck her. It was the way he'd said them, sharp, performative, designed to wound. She thought of her own research, the way modernization often erased the very ecosystems it claimed to enhance. Walter's story felt like a human parallel, a life discarded for the sake of aesthetics. With a deep breath, she posted the video to her personal account, unedited, unfiltered, just the truth as she'd seen it. Her caption poured out from a place of quiet fury. Today, I watched a 77-year-old Navy veteran get kicked out of Port Bayfield Marina because his wooden boat wasn't aesthetic enough. His name is Walter Briggs. For the last 15 years, he's taken underprivileged kids on free educational boat trips, and this is how his community repays him. The video tore through the internet like a wildfire racing across dry grass, unstoppable and fierce. In just 6 hours, it had amassed over 30,000 views, each one a testament to the raw, unspoken pain captured in its frames. By sunrise, the count had doubled to 60,000, and by the next evening, it had surged past 2 million. The comments section became a living shrine, a flood of stories woven together by gratitude and outrage. Former students spilled their hearts into the thread, their words trembling with reverence. One wrote of Captain Walter Briggs teaching an 8-year-old to tie a fishing knot, his steady hands guiding clumsy fingers until the boy beamed with pride, feeling for the first time like he could conquer anything. Another shared how Briggs had slipped a life vest into their little brother's arms when their family was scraping by, the gift given without fanfare, a quiet act of protection that lingered in their memory like a lighthouse in a storm. A third recounted Briggs taking their father fishing after a stroke had dimmed his spirit. The two men sitting in companionable silence on the water, the outing costing nothing but meaning everything. Parents added their voices, their stories rich with admiration for a man who seemed to live for the service of others. Teachers from Horizon Bell Elementary School posted grainy class photos, Briggs towering over a gaggle of kids, his weathered face softened by a smile that made every child feel like they mattered. Veterans from across the country joined the outpouring, some with medals pinned to their profiles, others with words heavy with the scars of war. They spoke of Briggs's quiet heroism, of moments when his kindness had anchored them through turbulent times, his impact stretching far beyond the sleepy docks of Bayfield Shores. Then came a comment that silenced the digital clamor. Posted late that night from a verified military account, it bore the username Radom. The profile picture showed a man in dress whites, silver stars glinting on his shoulder boards, his face carved with the weight of command. His message was sparse, just 6 words. Location confirmed, situation noted, standby. To those versed in military ranks, the words were seismic. This was Rear Admiral Thomas Rain, commander of the Navy's Atlantic Fleet 3rd Division, a figure whose authority made his appearance in a comment thread unthinkable. The internet froze, anticipation crackling through the silence. A user replied, their words shaky with awe. Wait, are you saying what I think you're saying? An hour later, Rain posted again, this time with a scanned newspaper clipping from 1984. The image showed a Coast Guard helicopter, its blades cutting through a tempestuous sky. A crowd of evacuees gathered on a rain-lashed tarmac. In the center, a young boy, frail and shivering, was wrapped in a foil blanket, carried in the arms of a young sailor whose face unmistakably belonged to a younger Walter Briggs. Beneath it, Rain wrote, that was me, and the man carrying me, that was Lieutenant Commander Walter Briggs. The revelation shattered the story's boundaries, turning a viral moment into a deeply personal reckoning, a debt carried across decades now laid bare. The nation erupted in response. Veteran forums shared the video, their discussions alive with respect and fury over Briggs's mistreatment. Navy families reposted it with captions like, this is why we serve, their pride laced with a fierce resolve to see justice done. Active duty sailors uploaded tribute photos, some saluting in crisp uniforms, others holding signs scrawled with messages for Briggs. Celebrity veterans, actors, authors, anchors lent their voices, their platforms amplifying the story until it resounded across the country. Local news crews. The morning sun cast a golden sheen over the tranquil waters of the marina, where a fleet of naval ships emerged from the horizon, gliding in precise formation across the shimmering surface. The destroyers, supply vessels, and the sleek command ship, USS Sovereign, moved with a grace that belied their formidable power, slicing through the calm like a memory long buried, now resurfacing with undeniable force. No announcement had preceded their arrival, No radio bulletins, no urgent alerts, just the silent, awe-inspiring presence of steel and purpose. On the shore, the rhythm of daily life faltered. Locals froze mid-stride, their morning routines abandoned as they turned toward the water. Tourists, clutching coffee cups and cameras, fumbled for their phones, their faces a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Children, too young to grasp the weight of the moment, pointed excitedly, their small voices piercing the hush. Even the marina's valet staff, trained to maintain polished smiles through any chaos, stood rooted in place, their polished facades crumbling under the weight of the spectacle. At precisely 7 o'clock a.m., the fleet came to a gentle stop just beyond the harbor's edge, forming a perfect arc that framed the horizon. 3 destroyers stood resolute, their angular silhouettes cutting sharp lines against the dawn. 2 supply ships flanked them, sturdy and unyielding, while the USS Sovereign, the command vessel, gleamed at the center, its presence radiating authority. The sight was both breathtaking and unsettling, a silent declaration that hung heavy in the air. Inside the marina office, Chad Ellison, the manager, stood at the window, his tablet slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. His heart raced as he stared at the surreal scene unfolding before him. The orderly world he prided himself on maintaining, branded polos, pristine docks, and curated clientele, felt suddenly fragile. "What in God's name is this?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he tugged at the collar of his shirt, the fabric suddenly constricting against his throat. His mind churned with questions, each more frantic than the last. Was this a drill? A show of force, or something far more personal? He couldn't tear his eyes away, the weight of the unknown pressing against his chest. Minutes later, a small military launch detached from the Sovereign, cutting a deliberate path toward the marina. Its engine hummed softly, a stark contrast to the thunderous presence of the fleet. The boat flew the American flag, its stars and stripes vivid against the morning light, and beneath it, the personal command standard of Rear Admiral Thomas Rain fluttered with quiet authority. 5 more vessels followed, each carrying sailors in pristine white dress uniforms, standing at rigid attention, their faces unreadable yet resolute. The crowd on the shore grew, swelling to over 200 as residents, tourists, and reporters gathered at the marina's primary berth, the same dock where Walter Briggs had been unceremoniously ousted months earlier. The air buzzed with unspoken questions, the silence thick with anticipation. When the launch reached the dock, Admiral Thomas Rain stepped ashore with measured precision, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden planks. His uniform was a vision of perfection, adorned with ribbons and stars that caught the rising sun, each decoration a testament to a life of service. Beneath the brim of his white cap, his face remained stoic, betraying no emotion, though his eyes, sharp and searching, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Flanked by officers on either side, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced storms and emerged unbroken. He stopped at the center of the dock, turned to face the crowd, and spoke. "I'm looking for Walter Briggs." His voice, steady and unamplified, carried across the still water, resonating in the chests of everyone present. It was not a question, but a declaration, laced with a quiet intensity that demanded attention. The crowd stood frozen, the name stirring memories some had tried to bury. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of shared history. Then from the edge of the crowd, an elderly woman stepped forward. Elena, known to all as the fishmonger, clutched her weathered hands together, her fingers trembling, not from fear but from the surge of emotion she could no longer contain. She had known Walter since the marina was little more than a cluster of rickety docks, back when he was a young sailor with a quick smile and a heart too big for the world. Her eyes, lined with years of toil and loss, glistened as she pointed toward the old public pier by the rocks. "They kicked him out," she said, her voice cracking with indignation. "He's down there, by the water's edge." The words hung in the air, a quiet accusation that cut through the crowd. Elena's heart ached as she spoke, her mind flooded with memories of Walter's kindness, how he'd repaired her nets without asking for payment, how he'd taught her grandson to tie knots, how he'd always carried the burdens of others without complaint. To see him cast aside by the marina's new management had been a wound she still carried. Admiral Rain's expression didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. A spark of resolve, perhaps, or the shadow of a debt long owed. He turned to his second-in-command, Chief Petty Officer Mitchell, a man whose weathered face bore the marks of years at sea. "Dispatch a retrieval team," Rain ordered, his voice low but firm. "Bring Command Master Chief Briggs back with full honors." Mitchell nodded sharply, his own thoughts racing. He had served under Briggs once, years ago, during a mission that had nearly cost them everything. The memory of Briggs's steady hand, guiding them through the chaos of a hurricane, still lingered in his mind, a beacon of courage he'd never forgotten. "Aye, aye, sir," Mitchell replied, his voice steady despite the emotion welling in his chest. 3 black SUVs, their military insignia discreet but unmistakable, pulled away from the convoy parked near the harbor entrance. Their tires crunched against the gravel as they sped down the coast road, disappearing into the distance. The crowd watched, a mix of awe and unease rippling through them. Admiral Rain turned back to the onlookers, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, some curious, some guilty, some merely caught in the moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried not anger, but a solemn determination that seemed to anchor the air itself. "For those unfamiliar with maritime tradition," he began, "when a sailor of distinguished service enters port, the fleet acknowledges their arrival. Today, we've come not for ceremony or spectacle, but to honor the legacy of a man this town chose to forget." Gasps rippled through the crowd, a wave of realization crashing over them. Reporters raised their cameras, their lenses glinting in the sunlight as they scrambled to capture the moment. Behind the marina office window, Chad Ellison sank deeper into the shadows, his stomach twisting with a cocktail of dread and shame. He had been the one to sign the order expelling Walter, citing aesthetic standards and modernization goals. At the time, it had felt like a necessary step to elevate the marina's image, to attract wealthier clients and polish the town's reputation. But now, with the weight of the fleet bearing down and Rain's words ringing in his ears, Chad felt the ground shift beneath him. His mind raced, replaying the decision, the complaints about Walter's weathered boat, the whispers of progress that had justified his actions. Had he been wrong? The question gnawed at him, leaving a bitter taste. Rain's voice cut through the murmurs, steady and unwavering. "Walter Briggs led missions through hurricanes, saving lives, including mine." The Admiral's tone softened for a moment, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his stoic facade. He could still feel the sting of that storm, the chaos of waves crashing over the deck, and Briggs's calm voice pulling them through. He taught children to sail, mended communities torn by loss, and asked for nothing in return. Yet this marina decided his boat didn't fit their standards. Rain's gaze shifted to the primary berth, the very spot where Walter's boat had once been moored, now gleaming with the polished vessels of the marina's elite clientele. The irony was not lost on him, and his heart ached for the man who had given so much only to be cast aside. The crowd stirred, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in quiet agreement. Lena stood taller, her trembling hands now steady, her eyes burning with pride for the man she'd always known as a hero. The reporters scribbled furiously, their minds racing with headlines. Chad, still hidden behind the window, felt the weight of Rain's words like a physical blow. He wanted to disappear, to undo the past, but the fleet's presence was a reminder that some choices could not be undone. Out on the water, the USS Sovereign stood as a silent sentinel, its crew watching from the deck, their hearts heavy with respect for the man they had come to honor. And somewhere down the coast, at the old public pier by the rocks, Walter Briggs waited, unaware that a fleet had come to bring him home. The weathered dock stretched out into the gray waters of Bayfield Shores, its splintered planks holding the memory of countless tides and the weight of a single man's legacy. This was where Walter Briggs had once tethered his boat, the Horizon Belle, a modest vessel that carried more integrity in its salt-worn wood and frayed ropes than most could hope to embody in a lifetime. Walter stood there now, his old fishing jacket hanging loose on his frame, the faded cap on his head tilted slightly against the coastal wind. His eyes, sharp as ever, traced the horizon, but his heart carried the ache of a town that had forgotten him. Behind him, nearly 100 sailors in crisp Navy uniforms moved with silent precision, unfurling a massive naval ensign that billowed across the dock like a living pulse. The fabric snapped and rippled in the breeze, a stark reminder of duty and sacrifice. Admiral Rain, a man whose presence commanded respect without a single raised word, stepped forward. His voice carried over the gathered crowd, steady and resolute. "We are here," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words settle, "because when a nation forgets its heroes, the Navy arrives to jog its memory." His eyes met Walter's, and in that moment, there was no mistaking the purpose of this gathering. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a reckoning. From the far edge of the marina, a line of sleek SUVs rolled back into view, their polished exteriors glinting under the overcast sky. Walter Briggs stepped out of one, his weathered boots hitting the gravel with a soft crunch. Confusion flickered across his face, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't expected it. Yet, as he walked toward the dock, his spine straightened with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced storms, both at sea and in life. His sharp eyes scanned the rows of sailors, their faces a mix of reverence and resolve, and something stirred deep within him. Pride perhaps, but also a pang of sorrow for the years Bayfield Shores had let slip away. As Walter reached the dock, the entire formation of naval personnel snapped to attention, the sound of their boots echoing like a single heartbeat. Admiral Rain faced him, his hand rising in a salute so crisp it seemed to cut through the air. Walter hesitated, his calloused fingers twitching at his side. Then slowly he returned the salute, his hand steady despite the weight of years. For the first time in what felt like forever, Bayfield Shores glimpsed what honor truly looked like. A quiet, unyielding strength that didn't demand recognition but commanded it all the same. The town itself had been drifting for years, untethered from the values that once anchored it. Bayfield Shores had traded its fishing nets for curated social media feeds, its soul for glossy spa menus, and its stories for hollow real estate taglines. The marina, once the heart of the community, had become a backdrop for selfies, its weathered docks ignored in favor of aesthetic perfection. But when the Navy arrived, everything shifted. They didn't come with blaring horns or grand speeches. They came with purpose, their disciplined presence slicing through the town's apathy like a ship cutting through fog. The naval ship loomed off the coast for 3 days, its silhouette a constant reminder of something greater. No official orders were barked, no drills announced. Yet everyone in Bayfield Shores knew this was no ordinary visit. It wasn't a training exercise or a photo op. It was a statement, etched in the quiet resolve of the sailors who moved through the town. They volunteered without fanfare, rolling up their sleeves to repaint the public dock, where Walter had been forced to moor his boat after being pushed out by new regulations and greedy developers. Others cleared piles of driftwood, replaced faded safety signs, and swept away debris that had gone unnoticed for years. Their work wasn't just about restoring the marina, it was about restoring dignity, not just to Walter, but to the town itself. At the Horizon Cafe, where the ugly confrontation that sparked this moment had been caught on video and shared across the internet, a small but powerful gesture appeared overnight. A chalkboard sign stood proudly out front, its message scrawled in bold letters. "Veterans and children eat free forever in honor of Walter Briggs." The cafe's owner, a woman named Clara, had tears in her eyes when she wrote it. Her father had served in Korea, and the memory of his quiet pride had never left her. She hadn't planned the sign, hadn't consulted anyone. It just felt right, the only way to respond to the shame of that day when Walter had been humiliated and she, like so many others, had stood by in silence. Across Bayfield Shores, a quiet wave of remorse began to ripple. People who had watched the confrontation unfold, their eyes glued to their phones as they pretended not to see, started showing up at Walter's small cottage on the edge of town. They came with handwritten letters, their words clumsy but earnest, spilling apologies and gratitude. Some brought casseroles or fresh-baked bread. Others brought their children, hoping to teach them what it meant to honor someone who had given so much. Ellen, the old fishmonger who had worked the docks since she was a girl, broke down as she wrapped her arms around Walter. "I should have said something," she sobbed, her voice thick with guilt. "I was right there. I saw it all happen." Walter, ever steady, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch as calming as the tide. "Communities lose their way sometimes," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of forgiveness. What matters is finding the courage to remember who you want to be. We even the mayor, a man named Harold Grayson, who had initially scoffed at the Navy's presence as an overblown spectacle, couldn't ignore the shift in the air. He was summoned aboard the USS Sovereign, the naval ship anchored just beyond the horizon. In the Admiral's conference room, surrounded by polished wood and the faint hum of the ship's systems, he was presented with Walter's full service record. Page after page detailed a life of quiet heroism, missions at sea, lives saved, communities uplifted, letters from families whose children had learned to fish on Walter's boat, testimonials from veterans who had found solace in his stories, all painted a picture of a man who had given everything to his town and his country. The mayor sat in silence, his earlier dismissals crumbling under the weight of the truth. The next morning, Harold stood before a packed town council meeting, cameras rolling as he signed an executive order with a trembling hand. The marina would be renamed Veterans Pier, a permanent tribute to those who had served. At Dock 12, where Walter had once been shamed, a bronze monument would rise, its surface engraved with words that would outlast them all. A nation is only as strong as its remembrance of those who kept its waters safe. The crowd erupted in applause, but Walter, standing quietly at the back, only nodded. He didn't need the monument. He didn't need the applause. What he needed, what he had always needed, was for Bayfield Shores to remember its heart. In the quiet coastal town of Bayfield, where the sea whispered secrets to those who listened, Ellison, the harbor manager who had unwittingly set a transformative chain of events in motion, tendered his resignation on a somber afternoon. The weight of his decisions pressed heavily on his heart, a storm of regret and realization swirling within him. With a heavy sigh, he packed his belongings, his hands trembling slightly as he penned a heartfelt letter. He slipped it into a sealed envelope and, under the cover of dusk, delivered it to Walter Briggs' doorstep. Inside was a concise yet deeply sincere apology, its words carrying the weight of his remorse. One particular sentence, its meaning profound and private, struck Walter so deeply that he never spoke it aloud. The words seemed to pierce through years of misunderstanding, and as he read them, his weathered face softened. He nodded slowly, a quiet acknowledgement of the gesture, then carefully folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box, nestled among his old service medals, relics of a life dedicated to duty, now joined by this unexpected confession. Meanwhile, Admiral Rain, a man whose stern demeanor belied a deep respect for those who served, approached Walter with an offer that carried the promise of recognition. He presented a substantial grant from a veteran honor initiative, funded by private donors in the Navy's Community Outreach Division. The sum was generous, a testament to the admiration Walter had unknowingly earned. But Walter, ever humble, felt a pang of discomfort at the thought of accepting it for himself. His eyes, sharp and clear, despite his years, met the Admiral's. "Put it towards something that lasts," he said, his voice steady but laced with conviction. "Start a program for kids who've never even seen the ocean." The words came from a place of quiet resolve, a vision born from his love for the sea and his belief that its lessons could shape young lives. Thus, the Horizon Project was born, a beacon of hope for underserved youth across Florida. With seed funding from the Navy and enthusiastic support from local businesses, it blossomed into a free maritime education initiative. The program offered classes in navigation, boating, safety, environmental stewardship, and above all, character, values Walter had lived by every day. He agreed to serve as its honorary director, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and responsibility. Though he'd never admit it, the Horizon Project took root swiftly, its impact rippling through the community. Active duty instructors from nearby naval stations, men and women who carried the weight of their own service, volunteered their shore leave to teach. They arrived with a quiet passion, eager to share their knowledge with children whose eyes sparkled with curiosity. Within weeks, the program's waiting list grew long, a testament to its promise and the hunger for opportunity it ignited. The children, many of whom had never set foot on a dock, absorbed lessons with wide-eyed wonder, their laughter and questions filling the air like the cries of gulls. On the final day of the fleet's presence in Bayfield, something extraordinary unfolded. The tourists, who once grumbled about Walter's weathered wooden boat cluttering their picturesque views, now gathered along the dock. Gone were their complaints. In their place was a newfound respect. They weren't there for selfies or fleeting moments of amusement, but to learn how to fold an American flag with the reverence it deserved. Their hands moved carefully under the guidance of young sailors, each fold a quiet tribute to something greater. Children, once restless and bored by Walter by the water, his boat, the Horizon Bell, became a floating classroom where he taught not just how to read the currents or steer through choppy waters, but how to respect the sea's power and mystery. Each morning he woke before dawn, his routine unchanged yet imbued with new meaning. He inspected the flag with the same care he always had, his calloused fingers brushing against the fabric as if greeting an old friend. But now, when he returned to port, the townsfolk no longer passed him by. They stood, their postures straight, and saluted. Not just the flag, but the man who carried its values. They waited patiently to shake his hand, their eyes no longer seeing a solitary figure in a worn jacket and cap, but a keeper of honor, a living reminder that duty endures long after the uniform is hung up. Walter Briggs never sought the spotlight. Recognition felt foreign to him, almost uncomfortable. He didn't display his medals on the wall or carry stories of his service in his pocket to share. To him, service wasn't a trophy to be polished. It was a quiet, consistent way of life, woven into the fabric of his daily actions. Yet, in the months following the Navy's return to Bayfield Shores, his legacy began to take root, subtle but unshakable. The marina, once just a place where boats bobbed and seagulls circled, was renamed Briggs Dock in his honor. A modest bronze plaque, affixed to the mooring post where he once stood alone, bore his name, but the plaque itself wasn't what mattered to Walter. It was the shift in the town's heart, the way locals slowed their steps as they passed, their gazes lingering on the flag fluttering above. Children clutching their parents' hands pointed to it and asked, "Who was he again?" And the parents, now touched by the story that had spread through Bayfield like a gentle tide, knew exactly what to say. Every Wednesday, the Horizon Bell set sail once more, no longer relegated to the back dock behind the fuel station. By unanimous town vote, Walter's boat was given Slip 1, the marina's most prominent berth, a quiet but profound gesture of respect. The children aboard were the same as ever, wide-eyed, nervous, brimming with questions. And Walter remained Walter, his boots scuffed, his hands rough from years of ropes and salt, his voice steady as he taught them to tie a cleat hitch or read a compass. But the town no longer overlooked him. They listened, their ears attuned to the wisdom in his words. And it wasn't just Walter who was seen anew. The wave of awareness that followed his story touched others too, veterans, neighbors, strangers, who found themselves inspired to live with a little more purpose, a little more honor in the quiet moments of their own lives. In a small coastal town where the salty breeze carried whispers of forgotten valor, lived Walter Briggs, a Korean war medic who had chosen a life of solitude. His days were spent tending to a modest wooden boat, its hull weathered by years of tides, much like the lines etched into his own face. Walter had long retreated from the clamor of the world, finding solace in the rhythmic lapping of waves against the shore. Yet his heart, heavy with memories of lives saved and lost, stirred with a quiet longing to share the lessons of his past, not for glory, but for meaning. When the local school extended an invitation for him to speak to the students, Walter felt a flicker of hesitation. The spotlight had never been his friend, but the thought of young faces eager to learn about the world beyond their smartphones tugged at his sense of duty. As he stood before the classroom, his voice steady but soft, he spoke of courage under fire, of comrades who never returned, and of the ocean's vast, humbling power. The children listened, wide-eyed, their usual restlessness replaced by awe, and Walter felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense that his story, though buried deep, still mattered. Across town, another man carried his own silent burdens. James Carter, a Vietnam veteran, had hung his uniform in a closet 3 decades ago, its medals tucked away like secrets too heavy to bear. The weight of those years, jungles, gunfire, and the cold indifference of a nation that hadn't welcomed him home had left him guarded, his pride tempered by pain. When the town asked him to help lead the Memorial Day ceremony, James felt a storm of emotions: pride, fear, and a faint hope that his service might still hold meaning. As he dusted off his uniform, his hands trembled, not from age but from the flood of memories it unleashed. Standing tall at the ceremony, the flag snapping in the wind, James felt the eyes of the community upon him, not with judgment, but with gratitude. His chest swelled with a quiet pride, not for the applause, but for the chance to honor those who hadn't made it back. The town, in that moment, seemed to rediscover a truth it had nearly forgotten: the power of remembering those who served, not just in grand gestures, but in the quiet act of standing together. The community itself was waking up, as if stirred from a long sleep. For years it had moved forward, caught in the rush of modern life, scrolling feeds, fleeting trends, and the noise of a world that prized attention over substance. But in honoring Walter and James, the town found something it hadn't realized it had lost: a connection to its own heart. The ceremonies, the stories shared under the spring sun, were more than events. They were a reclamation of values that had been buried under the weight of time. Neighbors began to talk more, to linger on porches, to ask about the past. The school children, inspired by Walter's words, started a project to document veteran stories, their young hands scribbling notes with a reverence that made their parents pause. The town, once adrift, was finding its way back to its moral compass, guided by the quiet strength of two men who had never sought to lead. Admiral Thomas Rain, a man whose name carried the weight of naval history, had made a promise to Walter years ago, forged in the camaraderie of their shared service. True to his word, he returned to the town often, his visits unannounced, like a ship slipping into harbor under cover of dusk. He and Walter would sit on Walter's weathered porch, the twilight wrapping them in a cool, quiet embrace. Words were sparse, but their silences spoke volumes of battles fought, of ships that had carried them through storms, of the unspoken bond between sailors who knew the sea's unyielding lessons. Thomas, with his polished metals and storied career, could have sought the spotlight, but he chose instead the creak of Walter's porch swing, the clink of a glass, and the steady rhythm of the tide. Their conversations drifted to old sea tales, storms weathered, ports visited, the quirks of long-gone vessels. Thomas's eyes would crinkle with amusement as Walter recounted a particularly stubborn engine repair, while Walter's heart eased, knowing his friend understood the weight of a life spent serving quietly. One evening, as the first stars blinked above the bay, Walter gazed out at the water, its surface catching the last light of day. His voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "Tom, I never wanted all this fuss," he said, his words heavy with sincerity. "I just wanted those kids to respect the ocean, to know it's bigger than them, bigger than all of us." Thomas, his face weathered but kind, nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The best leaders never chase the spotlight, Walter," he said, his voice warm with conviction. "That's why it finds them. Some thank yous take time, but they're no less real when they come." Walter didn't respond, but his eyes, glinting with the reflection of the bay, held a quiet pride, a pride not born of fanfare, but of a life spent doing what was right, even when no one noticed. He thought of the countless nights he'd patched up soldiers, the mornings he'd taught children to tie knots, the days he'd kept his boat afloat against the odds. That, he realized, was his legacy, not the ceremony, not the headlines, but the steady pattern of honor woven through his actions. In a world that often raced past its heroes, where fleeting likes overshadowed lasting legacies, Walter's story stood as a beacon. His life, simple, steadfast, unassuming, was a reminder that respect isn't a seasonal gesture, and honor doesn't fade with time. He had never asked for recognition, yet when the town finally saw him, it was as if a fog had lifted. The school that welcomed him, the community that stood for James, the Admiral who sat with him in silence. They all bore witness to a truth deeply American, that dignity endures even when it's overlooked. Walter's quiet heroism echoed in the neighbor who mowed every lawn on the block, the retired teacher who read to children at the library, the veteran who stood tall for the anthem despite the weight of their memories. His life was a testament to the power of small acts, teaching a child to fold a flag, helping without seeking praise, showing up day after day. The town's rediscovery of Walter and James was a call to action, a reminder to look closer, to see the quiet heroes among us. It challenged everyone to pause, to remember, to honor those whose service shaped the world in ways no headline could capture. Walter Briggs, with his wooden boat and soft-spoken wisdom, had steered a community back to its roots, proving that sometimes one stubborn, humble man could guide an entire town home.